I'm truly grateful for this opportunity. I've had a long association, which is perhaps not entirely known, with this university. The first Vice Chancellor, Professor Gurbaksh Singh, was a very dear friend. In fact, I had known him from the time when he was at BHU, and we were good friends, both he and his wife, who was a gifted singer as well. And then what's even more significant from my point of view is the fact that I taught for this university, because initially you didn't have adequate faculty, so some courses in economics were taught at the Administrative Staff College, and I started a course on energy economics. And in fact, one of my former students, who's now in Washington DC, still keeps in touch. This was a small group of students, and I enjoyed it very much. So it's a great pleasure for me to renew my acquaintance and my association with this university, which is being led so ably by a dynamic Vice Chancellor. And we also hope that a presence of TERI will be established in your neighborhood, courtesy your hospitality, and I hope we can create joint programs and activities that would only further the cause of education and the development of knowledge. In fact, the whole point of what I'm going to say today rests on the importance of knowledge in dealing with some of the challenges that we are facing across the globe. Now, the biggest challenge really relates to the fact that development throughout this world is not taking place on a sustainable basis. And why should I say that? Yes, if you go to the very basic definition of sustainable development, which was popularized essentially by the Brundtland Commission, it says in very simple terms that sustainable development is that form of development which meets the needs of the present generation without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, of course, the whole definition of needs could vary. Multi-billionaire might say that his needs are those of maybe a fleet of slick executive aircraft. A poor man who can't find his next meal just wants something to keep body and soul together. So there is clearly a value judgment involved in defining those needs. But I think the concept is very profound. What we should really be concerned about is carrying out that form of development which of course satisfies the needs in a very basic way of all the population in this generation without in any way adversely affecting the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So in simple terms, what we leave behind should really be no worse than what we have inherited. And that applies particularly to the natural resources and the ecosystems of this planet. Now here there is a concept which Amartya Sen has introduced, and as you know, he is somebody who has been deeply concerned about the issue of poverty and the whole implications in terms of equity and equitable development. And what he says is that you can worry about the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, but it would be wrong to ignore the fact that we should also take care of intra-generational problems within this generation itself. And one reason why I would say that we are not developing sustainably is also because disparities across the globe are increasing. They are increasing between countries and they are increasing within countries. Kenneth Boulding, who was a remarkable economist, and frankly I think he should have got the Nobel Prize in economics, but he never did because he was far ahead of his time and questioned the very basis of neoclassical economics, and possibly that's why he never made it. But what he said, and this was about maybe 35 years ago, he wrote, he said that it's unlikely that 200 years ago, the difference between the poorest and the richest in the world was probably no more than 1:5. And he said today it is 1:50. Now this was 35 years ago. If you were to carry out such a measure today, it would probably be much worse. So I think we are living in times where clearly the system that we have adopted for development is only breeding inequitable development. It's breeding disparities that clearly are not sustainable, because if the social structure itself is going to become characterized by such differences, then that structure cannot be treated as stable. There is inbuilt within that kind of a structure the elements of instability, which at some point of time will certainly lead to crises of some kind. So this is something that I wanted to highlight, and allied to this is a much larger problem, and that is what one can refer to as the tragedy of the commons. This was a term coined by Garrett Hardin, who was a biologist by profession, but I think he wrote something which was profoundly important at that time and is perhaps even more important today. And what he described as the tragedy of the commons is something that, if anything, has become accentuated to a much greater extent and far more acute than was the case then. And what he talked about through the example that's described over here is that if you had common grazing grounds, for instance, everyone would want to add more and more livestock, more and more cattle, so that they could graze freely on that ground. Now that would be perfectly all right, because historically there's been a balance in terms of diseases, in terms of other natural factors, which didn't lead to a major crisis in this regard. But what he said is, at some point you would reach a benchmark, you would reach a tipping point where the commons would really become the subject of a tragedy. And essentially this is what is happening with a lot of the commons that we are dependent on from for our lives and livelihoods. This includes the air that we breathe, this includes the water that flows in our rivers, and this certainly includes the soil, which is being polluted, which is being depleted of its nutritional qualities, and most importantly the oceans, which, may I say, are now reaching much higher levels of acidification than we have seen in the past, and that has serious implications for marine life and for things like the coral formations across the globe. So we really have to start looking at natural resources, irrespective of title of ownership, as something that clearly cannot be left in a worse condition than what we had inherited. Because if it is left in a worse condition, then obviously it's going to impact unfavorably on the ability of future generations to be able to meet their own needs. I would like to highlight a few facts that have come out from the Human Development Report, and I happen to be one of the advisors to the UN for the Human Development Report. This, I think, is a very significant document that's brought out annually, and it's an innovation in economic thinking which rarely comes out of UN organizations, and I'm not being unduly critical of UN organizations, but this was quite a remarkable innovation which was really pushed by the late Professor Mahbub al-Haq, who, as you know, was a distinguished economist, and others were associated with it, like Professor Amartya Sen, and Amartya is still associated with it. He's also an advisor for this. What it said, and if you look at the observations over here, the low HDI countries, that means countries which have low Human Development Index, have experienced the greatest loss of rainfall and greatest increase in variability. And what's really happening is, by changing the composition of gases in the Earth's atmosphere, we are affecting the Earth's climate. And this leads to a further inequitable set of impacts, such as what I've just mentioned, and implications for agricultural production and livelihood. These are also getting serious. Emissions per capita are much greater in very high HDI countries, that's the developed countries of the world, than in low, medium and high HDI countries combined because of energy intensive activities. So there are inequities, for instance, in energy consumption across the globe. Overall levels of greenhouse gases remain much greater in very high HDI countries, though 3/4 of the growth in GHGs since 1970 comes from the low, medium and high HDI countries. Now also this stands without accounting for the relocation of carbon intensive production to poorer countries. You know, one of the arguments made by the Chinese, for instance, is don't blame us for an increase in the emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, because we have become the factory to the world. A lot of industrial activity has shifted from the developed countries to countries like China, and therefore as a result the emissions have gone up, essentially in exporting and supplying goods and services to the developed world. So their contention is, and I've heard this from people at the level of ministers in the Chinese government, that 30 to 35% of the emissions can be attributed to goods that are actually being exported to the developed countries. Now that's an argument that I think needs to be kept in mind. Now I'd like to also mention that linking environmental risks and human development index is also an issue that we should look at, because after all, if human development is going to improve over a period of time, it can't possibly improve if the environment itself is deteriorating. So household environment deprivations in our country, we know indoor air pollution is a serious source of pollution and has very adverse impacts on human health, leading to morbidity and mortality. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Problems of clean water, improved sanitation, these of course are very severe at low HDI levels. That means in the poorer countries where human development is not at a very high level. Yet we have some very notable exceptions. Even in this country, if you look at a state like Kerala that has done very well, in this region you look at countries like Bangladesh, and this is something that Professor Amartya Sen always emphasizes, their HDI, even though they have a lower level of income, is certainly better than ours. And you could say the same about Sri Lanka as well, because they have invested and have created institutions by which healthcare, education and some of the basics have been provisioned far better than we have been able to do. Now environmental risks with global effects, greenhouse gas emissions, typically rise with human development index, because the model that we have adopted and is being pursued all over the world is one that is dependent essentially on intensification of energy use as economic growth continues at a higher level. Now this is something that needs to be questioned. This is something that perhaps needs to be revised, and I would like to submit that it's really institutions like this that can come up with new directions, new concepts and new theories by which development can move from high energy intensity to providing much higher levels of well-being and welfare at low levels of energy consumption. Now, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. This is something that we have stated in the 4th assessment report of the IPCC. 125,000 years ago, the polar regions were significantly warmer than present for an extended period. And what happened as a result? Well, we had sea level rise of 4 to 6 meters, which means the geography of this planet was very different at that point of time. How do we know about 125,000 years ago? Well, this is a fascinating area of research where scientists have basically been able to measure what happened at different stages of geological history. For instance, in Greenland, which is a 3-kilometer high mountain of ice over this huge expansive island, you have stations where they are drilling for ice. What has happened is as snow falls, the earlier ice cores get buried lower and lower. So if you were to drill a certain distance, you would be able to pick up a sample of ice which was, let's say, 200 years old. If you go deeper, it will be 400 years old, and so on. And what you do is you pick up those ice cores, there's air trapped inside them, and the composition of that air can easily be found out. Also several other characteristics. So as a result, you're able to map out a number of factors that existed at that point of time, including what kind of climate existed at that point of time. So we know now that at that stage the geography of this earth was very different. It's interesting, I ran into a forester who told me that there are in a district like Pithoragarh, which is in Kumaon, they have found shells of marine organisms. So apparently that part of the world, perhaps millions of years ago, was under the sea, and we know there have been cataclysmic changes whereby, you know, the mountains were lifted much higher. There were bodies of this earth which were submerged, have suddenly been thrust out as dry pieces of land, and so on. So the point I'm trying to make is that we are bringing about changes that perhaps are much too rapid and therefore can have consequences that we must be aware of. Now this gives you data from the beginning of industrialization. The first graph is essentially global average temperatures which have been plotted, and you'd observe that there are very distinct fluctuations which have taken place, and that's really the result of both human as well as natural factors which affect the climate. What are the natural factors that are relevant? Well, you have solar activity that affects the climate of this earth. You also have volcanoes which for several years leave a certain envelope of gases which are emitted, and that has a major impact on the earth's climate. But what is distinctly important over here is that in the last 60 odd years you see an increase in temperatures, and this is where the fingerprint of human activities becomes very, very clear. And in the last 60 odd years we have been affecting the climate of this earth as a result of increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. The second graph over here gives you sea level rise, which in the 20th century was an average of about 17 centimeters. Now that's pretty serious, because if you're living in a low-lying coastal area, or if you're living in the small island states, that 17 centimeters represents a threat to a stable and secure kind of existence. And the last figure over here gives you the melting of the ice that has taken place in the northern hemisphere in this period. Now here I'd like to highlight the fact that glacier melt is taking place, and this is projected to increase mud flows, flooding, rock avalanches, and to affect water resources within the next 2 to 3 decades. There is now no getting away from the fact that the glaciers across the globe are melting very rapidly, and this obviously will have implications for the flow of rivers which originate in glaciers. Here are some facts about the Gangotri glacier, the Ganga, Indus and Brahmaputra rivers, and so on. And it's estimated that about 500 million people in South Asia are dependent on river water from originating from these glaciers, and therefore their well-being, their economic activities will be affected, and there are about 250 million in China, and that's a pretty sizable number if you look at the global population. There are major impacts of climate change. The projected impacts include impacts on human health, and this shows the risk of dengue fever being much larger in India and China. I must mention that last year I came down with the dengue fever in October in Delhi, and that sort of spread of disease continued in Delhi till about November. Now that used to be unheard of, but today mosquitoes thrive far longer than they used to, and you know, I did my engineering education in a place called Jamalpur, which was run by the Indian Railways, and we always were given mosquito curtains, but we had come to a conclusion that mosquitoes work in pairs, because they'd get you sooner or later. One mosquito would lift up the mosquito curtain and the other guy would go in and get you. But I think what's happening now is, with the warming of the climate, they are going to survive much longer than was the case earlier. Crops are going to be affected, and we already have enough research evidence to show that climate change is affecting productivity of agricultural crops. Sea level rise is particularly important for India because we have a large coastline, and as I mentioned to you, in the last century sea level rise averaged about 17 centimeters, but this is not uniform. There are some parts where it's a little higher, other parts where it's a little lower. And water is an issue of serious concern to India. With the impacts of climate change, we could very well see water availability going down to about 2/3 of what it is today per capita. So this, once it goes below 1,000 meter cubed per capita, you could say that we are in a state of water stress. And here again, it needs to be emphasized that some parts will be much worse than others. Now, climate change will certainly increase malnutrition, deaths, disease and injury due to heat waves, floods, storms, fires and droughts. Forest fires are certainly on the increase because you have spells of dry weather and high temperature, when even a small little conflagration can lead to widespread forest fires, and this has been happening worldwide in the past few years. Diarrheal disease will increase, frequency of cardiorespiratory diseases will also increase. So projections of climate change clearly indicate that the health status of millions of people, perhaps tens and hundreds of millions of people, particularly those with low adaptive capacity, will be very normal in several parts of the world. Now, the whole purpose of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which came into existence in 1992 at the Rio Summit, is to see that we prevent what is known as dangerous anthropogenic, that means human-induced interference with the climate system. And the objective is that such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. I told another group yesterday about this gripping article that I read in Time magazine, the last issue of Time magazine, about the population of honeybees vanishing in several parts of the world, particularly in North America. And the honeybee is responsible not only for producing honey, but for the production of a whole range of other fruits, vegetables, almonds, and so on. And almond exports, where the US is clearly the largest exporter, are being affected because there aren't enough honeybees to bring about the fertilization and the production of almonds. So the point I'm trying to make is that this issue of achieving within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change. If climate change is very rapid, then clearly some species are going to be threatened and may not survive, and therefore they may not be able to adapt naturally to that level of climate change. And the same is true of food production. If there's a sharp decline in productivity, obviously that's going to affect human security and human well-being, and similarly economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So the point I'm trying to make is that we need to ensure that we take actions by which the risks associated with climate change can be minimized, if not actually eliminated. And this is what also requires addressing the larger context of sustainable development, the larger challenge of being able to come up with a system of development which is totally and truly sustainable. And without appropriate measures, climate change will exacerbate poverty, because the worst affected will be the poorest in the world and will act as a threat multiplier. Now, I also wanted to just quickly mention that rural people depend overwhelmingly on natural resources, and if the health of those natural resources will be affected adversely, then clearly that's going to be to the disadvantage of maybe 350 million people who rely on forests for subsistence and incomes, and around 45 million people fish for a living. And if you look at our rivers in this country, there's hardly any scope for fish living in a large number of those rivers. So those who are dependent on fishing from rivers will probably have to forget getting any food out of the river systems at all. Indigenous people are particularly vulnerable, because those living in small island states in particular will face very serious problems. One of them I might explain is shrinkage of what is called the water lens. In an island, typically you have a very small area within the center of the island where you've got water which can be potable, it can be drunk. But with sea level rise, the intrusion of seawater goes further onshore, and as a result this so-called water lens will also become saline. So then you need huge quantities of energy to carry out desalinization, and these are essentially very poor countries. The point I also wanted to make is that natural disasters typically take away far more lives in the developing countries than in the developed world. And between 1970 and 2008, if you look at all kinds of disasters, 95% of the deaths have taken place in developing countries. So really speaking, if we were to look at what creates disaster risk, there are weather and climate events. Now some communities and societies are very vulnerable, and of course the extent of exposure also determines what happens with disaster risk. So what you find is a subset of all these three factors which really define risk. And if we want to reduce this risk, well, firstly we need to have a much more stable climate, and that's something I'll come to in a minute. We have to make sure that the vulnerability of people is reduced. If you look at people in the Netherlands, a large part of their territory is below sea level, but they don't have to worry simply because they've got dikes. Those dikes have been constructed to keep the sea out, and they are now in fact increasing the height and strengthening the dikes, because they are looking at sea level rise in the future, which would only add to the risks. So you could do that, or the extent of exposure. So you can reduce that exposure by having proper regulations and laws by which people are not allowed to build in vulnerable coastal areas and have to live in other places, or there might be other means by which you can minimize that risk, that exposure. Now let me also say there are strategies that can help manage disaster risk. If you look at this terrible tragedy which took place in Uttarakhand, firstly, a lot of the houses that were there in the floodplain should not have been allowed to be built there. So you need regulations, you need effective enforcement of those regulations to make sure that that doesn't happen. Secondly, you would also have to have a machinery by which, as soon as you get warning of extreme weather like a heavy precipitation event, then you're able to mobilize that machinery to move people to locations of safety. And possibly you would need to have means by which, whether it's ropeways or whatever, by which you evacuate people, because there are limited roads that you can construct over there, and in an emergency obviously they'll get choked. You will not be able to remove people to safety. So I think these are things that we need to map out, and we need to come up with what one calls adaptation measures. And this is just a quick listing of some of these: increasing income levels, education, technical skills that would help people adapt to the impacts of climate change. Information and creating awareness is very important. Improving disaster preparedness and management, improving healthcare systems, and so on. So I think every society, every community, and particularly at the local level, we'll have to come up with adaptation measures to deal with some of the impacts of climate change. And of course, human society has a record of being able to adapt to weather changes. We have managed, even in places like Rajasthan, where people have had prolonged droughts for 2 or 3 years, they are able to manage. They come up with coping strategies. They come up with adaptation measures that ensure some degree of continuity in the economic conditions. But neither adaptation nor mitigation can really solve the problem. You need both. Mitigation means you've got to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. That's how you'd be able to stabilize the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere, and thereby stabilize the climate itself, or the increase in temperature and changes that would take place. So this is something which we have to do at the local level in the case of adaptation, and at the global level in the case of mitigation. Now here I'd like to focus your attention only on the top line, which says that if you want to stabilize temperature increase to say around 2 degrees Celsius, and you want to do that at least cost, then CO2 emissions must peak no later than 2015. So that means we have about 2 years in which we can bring about changes such that CO2 emissions reach a peak in 2015, and after that they start declining. And if you don't do that, then the costs you incur in stabilizing the climate will become progressively higher. And how much is the cost of this kind of mitigation? Well, we have estimated that in 2030 it would be less than 3% of the global GDP if you were to pursue a path of mitigation, that means reduction of these emissions. And less than 3% of the GDP really means that the level of prosperity that you would have reached in 2030 will at best or at worst be delayed by a few months or a year. There are of course huge co-benefits from mitigation, and these are in the nature of higher energy security, because if you are going to use more renewable energy, use energy more efficiently in general, then clearly you're creating a much more secure energy system for the world. And there are health benefits in terms of lower pollution at the local level, and that certainly is something worth quantifying. Also, there's some indication that there's much higher employment with some of these measures, which needs to be kept in mind as well. So we need to come up with policies that essentially lead towards much lower intensity of emissions of these greenhouse gases. This is just a repeat of what I've just said, some of the co-benefits from mitigation. Now, for very good reasons of equity, it's required under Article 3 of the Framework Convention on Climate Change that the first set of steps will have to be taken by the developed countries. They are the ones who have been overwhelmingly responsible for having caused this problem in the first place historically. They are the ones who have the technological and economic muscle to be able to bring about change, and so on. So this is something which is the subject of negotiation, and we have not really been able to resolve what and who is going to bring about change in the future. Essentially what we need is to come up with a new structure of development, because if we have to move towards a sustainable pattern of development, then we need new institutional arrangements. Perhaps a new geographical distribution of activities whereby we have much more equitable growth. On demographic issues, the question is whether we should go in for a pattern which is overwhelmingly based on urbanization, or should we bring the benefits of technology, the benefits of development to rural areas? Is that much more sustainable? And of course, we would probably have to alter our lifestyles and consumption patterns. So all of these would require some rethinking on the way we are going to develop in the future. And I think what Mahatma Gandhi said was absolutely right. He, in so many respects, was ahead of his time. He said a technological society has two choices. First, it can wait until catastrophic failures expose systemic deficiencies, distortion, and self-deceptions. Secondly, our culture can provide social checks and balances to correct for systemic distortion prior to catastrophic failures. And I think in this day and age, when we have the knowledge, we have the awareness, and we have the means by which we can bring about a distinct shift to those measures that would secure the lives and property of people today and in the future, then clearly it is the second set of options that Gandhiji had highlighted which we must adopt. And I therefore feel that institutions of higher learning like this remarkable institution must bring about a change in thinking, must have a major impact on the way we define our development strategies and pathways by which we are going to grow in the future. Because unless we do that, unless we come up with new paradigms of growth, then clearly we would just move along business as usual, and business as usual is certainly not going to be sustainable. It's going to create problems not only for this generation but certainly for generations yet to come. So I'll stop here and I'll be very